For how much longer can Algeria's ailing president rule over his country's youthful population? 77-year-old Abdelaziz Bouteflika won re-election this week, with more than 80% of a vote, opponents dismissed as a fraud. He himself cast his vote in a wheelchair in what was a rare public appearance since suffering a stroke last year. Turnout in the elections was just over 50% in a country where 70% of the population is under 30. And according to the International Office for Migration, young people in Algeria have only one preoccupation: leaving the country. So, do they have any reason to stay in Algeria under another term of President Bouteflika? Nabila Ramdani is a Paris-born freelance journalist of Algerian descent who joined me earlier from Algiers.
Young people in particular have stayed away from the voting stations, and they've clearly boycotted the vote. 70% of the Algerian population is under the age of 30. The vast majority of them are unemployed. There are very dire structural problems, including housing problems. Basic services like health and education are very limited as well. And young people in particular lack opportunities, generally speaking. And what the youths are particularly angry about is that Algeria is not really exploiting its vast economic wealth to the benefit of its entire population to solve endemic social problems. It's the biggest country in Africa. It has massive oil and gas reserves, and it's a leading OPEC member. It's the third largest supplier of natural gas to the European Union. And in terms of energy sales only, the money Algeria makes amounts to $200 billion in foreign reserves. So it's an extremely rich country, but unfortunately, resources are not distributed evenly and certainly not invested towards, a dynamic young population.
Why is that?
One has to bear in mind that Bouteflika has presented himself as a stability candidate. He has played a historical role in his country. He obviously was involved in the War of Independence and won independence from France in 1962. And following the dark 90s, as they were called, a solid decade of civil war, which ended up with up to 250,000 Algerians dying, Bouteflika came to power at the end of the civil war, and he brought about security and indeed national reconciliation, and he's credited for that role. He's very much the person who managed to defeat Islamic terrorism, even though the fight continues against terrorists in some parts of the countries in many ways. But young people believe that he has outlived his historical role.
I mean, given that there is so much dissatisfaction amongst young people in Algeria, why haven't we seen the public protests that characterized other Arab countries during the so-called Arab Spring?
Well, it has to be said that, dissent in Algeria is very marginal. There are, of course, lots of opposition groups. Perhaps the most high profile of them is a group called Barakat, enough effectively, and has been protesting a lot throughout the campaign and indeed calling for investigation into the electoral process with accusations of vote rigging. But the protest movements in Algeria are not a unified entity. They're not homogeneous groups. They do not want the same thing, and they are very weak. And because of the history of Algeria, its unique, turbulent history, marked and indeed marred by violence and bloodshed over the last 50 years, there is no appetite in Algeria for more of that. And there's a realization that Algerians would rather work within an imperfect and indeed corrupt system towards, improvement and progress, rather than seek for violent and indeed radical change.
And whoever does come after him, do you see that person bringing about the kinds of political and economic reforms which you seem to suggest Algeria is very much in need of?
It doesn't seem to be a conscious decision made by the military, which effectively runs the country, and intelligence officers to put forward somebody who belongs to a new generation of technocrats. And it has to be said that Western governments have been quite supportive of stability rather than change in Algeria. They view Bouteflika as a predictable player who they can work with. And countries like Britain, France, and indeed the US have an enormous interest in Algeria, not least of all because of its energy resources, but also as a great ally in the war on terror.
That was Nabila Ramdani speaking from Algiers.